everyone! Yesterday when we read the Parker Inheritance, Candace and Brandon were at Ellie Farmer's house and they were getting some more information about the secret tennis game and the Washingtons. So that is where I'm going to start up again. But it wasn't, Tori asked. She was leaning in, just like Brandon and Candace. Ellie Farmer shook her head. Word started to spread that night. How could it not? The Perkins boys had just beat the best tennis team in the state. The best white tennis team in the state. Most of us couldn't care less about tennis, but that didn't matter. Our boys won, and that meant something. Candace was reminded of how Mr. Gibbs and Miss Kathy talked about black high schools. Ellie Farmer sounded just as proud. Anyway, Marion Allen didn't like that a whole bunch of us knew about the game. He gathered up some of his buddies and attacked Coach Stubb. Beat him and one of his players up real bad. Coach was never the same after that, but neither was Marion Allen. He lost his left eye that night. Her hands shook as she clutched her blanket. What's worse, the cowards didn't just threaten Coach Stubb and the boys. They threatened... Her voice caught. They threatened to do horrible things to Siobhan. Candace had to turn away. She couldn't take the look on Miss Farmer's face. It was like she was pained and sad and furious all at the same time. Of course, the police didn't do anything about it. Wouldn't even consider arresting Marion. If anything, they would have found a way to arrest Coach Stubb. She sighed. Siobhan and her family moved to Maryland. They came back a handful of times to visit, but never stayed too long. Brought up too many bad memories. What happened to Mr. Washington? Brandon asked. He passed away a few years after they left Lambert, Miss Farmer said. They built and dedicated the tennis courts at Vickers Park to him. He's buried in Maryland with... Wait, Candace lurched forward. I'm sorry, those tennis courts, they were dedicated to Coach Washington? Ellie nodded. Sure were. I was there for the ceremony. Do you know when they were built? Candace continued. 2006 or 2007? Long before that, Ellie said. It was back in the 80s. Siobhan was still alive. Came to the dedication and everything. Did they reconstruct them or something like that? A few years later? Candace asked. Maybe with a private donation? The older woman shook her head. The tennis courts were perfectly fine until that crazy fool from the city went and had them dug up. I mean, come on, what was she thinking? Candace's stomach twisted into a knot as Ellie railed on her grandmother. Candace balled her fists up and then shoved them underneath her thighs. As much as she wanted to argue, Candace could tell it would do no good. Ellie Farmer had long ago made up her mind, and there was nothing Candace could say to make her reconsider. She had to show her. Going back to Siobhan, Brandon said softly, did she ever date anyone when she was in high school? Or even after she left town? Ellie picked up a cookie. She was married once, but very briefly. Otherwise, she never mentioned anyone serious. She never dated anyone in high school either. Of course, Coach Dub would have killed her and the boy if she had. No one was good enough for little Dub. Candace wiped her hands on her jeans. Miss Farmer, have you ever heard of James Parker? Ellie tilted her head and blinked a few times. Can't say that I have. Why do you ask? Well, we think that he knew Siobhan, Candace went on. He donated a bunch of money to create the memorial room at Perkins. He spent most of his life in Colorado, but we thought maybe he grew up in Lambert. I know almost everyone who graduated from Perkins while I was there, she said. You sure you got that name right? Candace shrugged. To be honest, she wasn't sure about anything. Well, I wish I could be of more help with that, she said. Anything else you want to know about Siobhan? Candace and Brandon looked at each other. I think that's it, she said. Can we call you if we have more questions? Sure thing, she said. Now I have a question for you. Did you bring any of those yearbooks? We brought one, Brandon said. It's in the car. I'll go get it. The door chimed as Brandon exited the house. Rosalie was with him when he returned. It's about time for your medicine, Rosalie said to her mother. And then you need to lie down. I'm fine, she said, but Miss Farmer had begun to slump in her seat and had yawned more and more as the conversation went on. Where's that yearbook? It's from your senior year, Brandon said, handing it to her. She held the yearbook like it was fragile glass. Want to see your mother when she was young and beautiful? She asked her daughter. Mama, but Rosalie sat down on the armrest and watched as her mother opened the yearbook. Miss Farmer murmured to herself as she flipped through each page, pausing every once in a while to talk about someone from long ago. Candace couldn't tell if she was talking to her daughter or to herself. Or maybe she was talking to the people in the pictures. Miss Farmer stopped on the page with Siobhan and ran her fingers across the photograph. She was so kind and generous, she said. I wouldn't have graduated without her. If I hadn't graduated, I would have never gotten that job at the telephone company. And I would have never met Jean. And Ellie's eyes were wet as she looked up at her daughter. You have no idea how much we owe her. Rosalie leaned over and kissed her mother on the forehead. Her eyes were wet, too. Well, I really appreciate this, Miss Farmer said once she finished paging through the yearbook. She closed it and held it out to Candace. It's nice to go back and... Where did you get that? Candace froze, her arms stretched out forward, reaching for the yearbook. Ma'am? That bracelet. Ellie put the yearbook down in her lap, then grabbed Candace's arm, almost causing her to fall over. Rosalie placed her hand on her mother's back. Mama, you should calm down. That bracelet, she repeated, cutting her daughter off. Where did you get it? It's my grandma's, Candace said after a moment. She didn't want to admit who her grandmother really was, especially with the way Miss Farmer had talked about her. That used to belong to Siobhan. I recognize it anywhere. Miss Farmer traced a dark, wrinkled finger across the letters stamped into the aluminum. See, right there. S.W. for Siobhan Washington. Candace's eyes widened. She had always thought the letters were M.S. for Mississippi. She'd been sure of it. Rosalie pried her mother's hand away from Candace. It's getting late, she said. Perhaps y'all should leave. Miss Farmer, do you know if Siobhan had anything engraved on the inside of the bracelet? Candace asked, rubbing her wrist. The woman pursed her lips together, then shook her head. No, I never saw the inside, but I'm sure that it's hers. Ellie Farmer frowned. Or who knows, my memory isn't what it used to be. She picked up the yearbook and handed it to Candace. When you get home, you be sure to ask your grandma where she got that thing from. Candace took the yearbook. Sure thing. Okay, what just happened back there? Brandon asked as soon as they reached the car. Is that really Siobhan's bracelet? I don't know, Candace said. Grandma never mentioned that it used to belong to someone else. But then again, Grandma didn't talk about a lot of things. And what was the other engraving about? He asked. The word love is stamped on the inside. She slipped the bracelet off her wrist and inspected it. All this time I thought the letters were MS for Mississippi, where my grandmother was born. She knocked her fist against her forehead. I'm such an idiot. I didn't realize I was looking at it upside down. But how could your grandmother have Siobhan's bracelet? Tori asked as they pulled away from the house. They never met, right? No, I don't think so. The aluminum was cool in Candace's hands. But who knows? Brandon didn't speak for a long time. Finally, once they reached the interstate, he said, You said your grandma didn't find anything underneath the tennis courts, right? But what if that's not true? You think she found the bracelet there? Tori asked. It's the only way, he replied. What do you think, Candace? But Candace was too busy staring at the bracelet to answer. If Brandon was right, if her grandmother had found the bracelet there, then her grandmother might not have been off track. Maybe she was supposed to dig up those courts. Maybe this was another clue. Maybe she hadn't made a mistake after all. Chapter 27, July 31st, 1957. Chip slung his duffel bag over his shoulder and rushed out of the pool locker room. The same locker room that Milo Stanford would use 60 years later. Chip's hair was wet, and his shirt slung to his damp skin. He paused to reach under his pant leg and scratch at the red splotches on his calf. He hadn't put on enough sunscreen during his shift. He'd pay for it come tomorrow, but he wasn't going to worry about it now. He hesitated once he passed the pool's rough iron fence. Glenn Allen and some of the other lifeguards, his old teammates, remained in the parking lot, with Glenn's truck idling beside Chip's Chevy. Looking good, Chip, Billy Maynard said as Chip neared them. Got a hot date? Me and Penelope can double. Get a real car and some real money, and I'll consider letting you date my sister, Glenn said through his open window. Billy had a crush on Penelope Allen for years, though she never gave him the time of day. Chip could empathize. Aren't y'all late for practice? Chip asked. Coach Turner's going to have a fit. It's in the middle of summer, Glenn said. He revved his engine. What's he going to do? In the year that Chip had been away at college, Glenn had started to sound a lot like his older brother. It's your funeral, Chip said. Glenn stepped out of his truck. You have to help the colored kids? Chip's fingers tightened around the strap of his bag. I'm off to help my father. Who is helping the colored kids? It's his job, Chip said. It's what he's supposed to do. Yeah, but it ain't your job, Harold Bucker said. If Chip had to, he figured he could take Glenn in a one-on-one fight. He wasn't so sure about Harold, though. Know what I think? Harold continued. I think you like it. And what if I do? Harold fished his tin of snuff from his back pocket and pinched off a piece. How about that? You went off to a fancy college and came back loving black people. He tucked tobacco in his mouth, between his cheek and his jaw. That's what happens when you let them use the same water as civilized people. You start to become contaminated. Good thing they can't swim here. Yet, Chip wanted to add. They can't swim here yet. Billy cleared his throat. He had moved to the bed of Glenn's truck, his racket in hand. His affection for Penelope Allen aside, Billy was clearly the most level-headed of the three boys. We could use your help, Chip. I can't play, Chip said. You know the rules. Coach Turner and Big Dub had agreed to let this year's graduates participate, but no one older. But you've seen them in action, Glenn said, now leaning against Chip's Chevy. You know their weaknesses. Y'all sound nervous, Chip said. Think you're gonna lose? We ain't gonna lose, Glenn said. But we want to beat them bad. Teach them a lesson. Chip shook his head. You guys will be fine. And don't forget, this is supposed to be a friendly game. Guess that's a no then, Glenn said and stepped away from Chip's truck. And Chip, there ain't nothing friendly about this game. And I'm going to stop right there. So I'm wondering what you guys think about Candace having Siobhan's bracelet. How do you think she got it?